This is Lisa from MobileTechReview, and we've covered a lot of high-end gaming laptops. This one is more affordable. It's still not cheap. This is not Dell Inspiron gamer level cheap, but at $12.99, the Asus ROG GL553VE packs a good deal of bang for the buck. But is it enough? We're going to find out now. So the Asus ROG GL553VE is actually the less expensive counterpart to the GL502 that we reviewed. Confusing, isn't it? Usually higher numbers mean the higher line item, but not in this case. The 502 actually sits above it. 502 is available with the same quad-core Intel CPUs, Core i7, 45 watt, but it has GTX 1060 or 1070 graphics available both ways. This one has GTX 1050, or in the case of our model, a 1050 Ti, which is a little bit faster than the 1050, following NVIDIA's usual naming convention. What's interesting, though, is the GL55X series used to look noticeably different from the Strix, which is a newer kid on the block, this one being the Strix, the 502. Now they made them look an awful lot alike. If I open it up inside, in fact, they have the same lids. They have what looks like the same bottoms at first blush, but you can see that right here that you've got just about the same thing, except for this one goes full orange. I'm wearing orange just to express my solidarity with it. So people apparently didn't like the orange too much, so they got rid of that. But you can see the similarity. You can also see what they've changed. Notice the space bar over here on the 553. It's got an extension on the left-hand side. Maybe that makes it easier for gaming. I'm left-handed, so I probably do things opposite from you folks, so it's hard to guess. And they move the arrow keys down a little bit. But otherwise, you're looking at pretty much the same thing, right down to the same trackpad that works fine for mousing and tapping with your finger, but it's pretty rotten to click on, very stiff. Sometimes misses right clicks, kind of loud. Same faux brushed aluminum black interior here, same logoing. Speakers are firing out the front over here, so a lot of similarities. And in fact, for the GL502 line, what they've done is they've changed the color accents on the outside. So the latest update of this with Intel Kaby Lake, this one is 6th generation Skylake, a couple of months older, that's all. But they've moved this to have color scheme more like the G752 line, the high line, that kind of coppery, tannish finish instead of the black aluminum lid. This one also has the black aluminum lid. It looks just like this one, but our review unit loaner came from Exotic PC, so they put their skin on it so that you'll notice that it came from Exotic PC. Likewise, the big Exotic PC logo underneath the screen. Now, they're a reseller of laptops, and they carry MSI, they carry Asus, they carry a couple of good brands, Sager, Clevo, and all that sort of thing. And their prices are very competitive with big box retailers, but they offer some extra services. So I recommend them if you're not the kind of person who wants to do it-yourself upgrades yourself, but you do want to upgrade some components or get some better thermal paste. Like they put icy diamond thermal paste on this. It does make a difference. This is my personal ROG GL502, and I did take it apart and repaste it. And even though folks say, oh, Asus uses great paste on their gaming laptops, it was dried already after like a month. So worth it there. So what's nice about the GL553, other than the fact that it has a more budget-friendly price? Well, it's pretty light and thin for a gaming laptop. 5.5 pounds, which is 2.5 kilograms, 1.2 inches thick, that's 30.5 millimeters. And you get the same Intel Core i7 quad-core 45-watt CPU that you'll get in bigger gaming laptops too. This is 7th gen Intel Kaby Lake CPU in here, Core i7-7700HQ, clocked at 2.8 gigahertz. There's on Asus's website, they list a Core i5 option too, so I wouldn't be surprised if there's a real budget model that has a Core i5, which should be a quad core as well. There's 16 gigs of DDR4 RAM in here. At 32 gigs is max. There are 2 DDR4 RAM slots. And you get the NVIDIA GTX 1050 Ti, 4 gigabyte GDDR5. And that's with NVIDIA Optimus, which means it's switchable between that and Intel HD 630 integrated graphics, which means you can save some battery life on the road unplugged when you're not gaming and you just want to use it for everyday things like streaming video, web browsing, working on Excel, you name it, that sort of thing. But there's only a 48 watt-hour battery in there, and that's about the same size as a 13-inch Ultrabook with a dual-core 15-watt CPU, so don't expect miracles there. In our tests, we had managed about 4.5 to 5 hours of streaming 1080p video using Amazon Prime and Netflix. Comes with a 120-watt charger, which is appropriate for the hardware that's inside. Something that's new is the Rgb Backlight Keyboard instead of the usual Asus going with the red-only backlighting, and also the reduction of those orange accents in some places, i.e. the keyboard area. Now there's a ROG Aura app that controls the backlighting scheme, so you can go all with a single color, you can make it look more staid for work with white backlighting if you want, you can go all multicolor on it, you name it. So it's zone backlighting, not individual key backlighting like you'd see on the Razor Blade, but you know, zone lighting is pretty useful. Another nice thing you don't see so much on 15-inch laptops is a number pad. The only drawback is the number pad there's no space between it and the regular keyboard, so it's a little easy to reach over and accidentally hit those keys. Key travel is good and it's crisp too. I really like this keyboard to type on. The keys are pretty stiff. They're anti-rollover keys. I like that feeling. Some people prefer a softer touch keyboard though. Kind of retro here, but there's actually a DVD burner, an actual DVD drive in here. Well, I guess they had space. I would have liked it if they put more battery in there instead, but hey, what can you do? They only need one fan in this, unlike the two fans in the GL502, because it has higher-end graphics that needs more cooling, so they had room for the optical drive. 1.2 megapixel webcam, that's a little bit better than average, so you Twitch people, you might appreciate that. You can stream yourselves in beauty. Ports are pretty ample on this, as you would expect for a 15-inch gaming laptop. You got two USB 3.0 ports, one USB 2.0 port. That one's on the right side. Now, they're all colored the same orange, so you actually have to look at the little symbol on them. So if it makes a difference to you. If you're using a USB 3.0 peripheral, like an external hard drive, for example, then you want to use the faster port, but a mouse or keyboard, perfectly fine with the USB 2.0 port. There is one USB-C port here, Gen 1. This is not a Thunderbolt 3 port. This is just USB-C. That said, speeds on it were just fine using a USB-C SSD hard drive, one made by Samsung. It has an HDMI port, Ethernet port, and there's an SD card slot on the front edge where you might miss it at first, but there you go. It's there. Now, because this is less expensive, you don't get all the fancy-dancy stuff that you would on a higher-end model, which means 5400 RPM, 1 terabyte hard drive instead of the usual 7200 RPM. The first thing I would do is run and replace that with a Samsung Evo 850 SSD anyway. They're getting pretty cheap these days. It's going to be a lot faster, and that way it's not affected by bumps and jumps and the usual mechanical problems of having a spinning hard drive. So that would be my future to-do list if I bought one of these. And the SSD is a SATA interface M.2 SSD, not the faster PCIe NVMe SSD that you get in the ROG GL502 and in other more expensive gaming laptops. And if you look at the benchmarks, that's about 1/3 of the speed that we get with the SSD in the GL502. So it does make a difference, but in everyday use, can you tell? Unless you're duplicating media constantly, generating lots of files, yeah, probably really not so much. To get inside is pretty straightforward and a lot like the ROG GL502 that we reviewed. You can see all the screw holes here, Phillips head screws, but there's one customer hostile thing right here. Glued down, see this little suspicious rubber piece? Well, there's another screw there. Same Phillips head screw, they're all the same kind of screw at least, but be mindful, you're going to have to pull this up and take that screw out too. Take off the cover. There's plastic clips, of course, that you have to work off. Not the end of the world there. And look, one large fan, and this is where it exhausts heat from. It intakes from the bottom cover only. So it doesn't from here because, well, this is the battery, a cylindrical shape, 48 watt-hour battery. It obviously would block any airflow here. The 502 does actually use the back edge for some airflow. Only needs one fan because the GTX 1050 and 1050 Ti don't make as much heat. So we got single heat pipe, CPU, GPU. We got a little gooey stuff right there, covering some caps. This is your RAM right here. And what's nice is Asus did this too on the 502. This has 2 RAM slots and it has 16 gigs of RAM. They used a single 16 gig RAM module, even though that's more expensive than using 2 8s. The drawback is because this has Optimus, when you're using Intel HD 630 integrated graphics, well, you're not going to get dual channel performance there, but it doesn't really make a difference because you got a dedicated GPU here anyway for when you want performance. Here's your M.2 SSD. This is a Micron brand. This is SATA again, M.2 SATA. It is not PCIe NVMe, but Asus does list that as an option, so I'm assuming that the motherboard probably supports NVMe SSDs if you want to upgrade to something even faster. Your 5400 RPM hard drive right here, 2.5 hard drive bay, and right there, that's your SD card slot under the little colorful plastic cover. And the Wi-Fi card is right over here. This is Intel 7265AC. It's a last generation wireless card. What up with that, Asus? I know they're trying to find a way to make this cheaper, but I thought that was slightly cheeseball. It's an okay card, that said. You do get 802.11 AC plus Bluetooth. And of course, that's the optical drive. Lots of room for that, so that we don't need two fans in this kind of design. So that's certainly different from the ROG 502 again, which is available with the GTX 1060 and 1070 that make a lot more heat. Like most gaming laptops, you get a matte IPS non-touch display. It's full HD resolution, and that's a perfectly fine match for the graphics card that's inside here. Believe me, in terms of gaming, you're not going to be going above 1080p in most current games. It's actually, you know, even it's funny thing about displays, sometimes experientially, even though they'll be, say, this is an LG displays. There's LG displays in Alienwares and Acers and Predators, you know, all that sort of thing. Even with the same metrics, sometimes some look better than others. And just like the ROG GL502, the display in this one really has a little bit more dynamic range, a little bit of pop. The brights just look a little bit zingier, and the colors pop just a little bit more. Again, in terms of metrics from our colorimeter, you're looking at pretty much the same stuff across the competition in this price range and so on. But it's a nice looking display. Also, you know, Asus was once the king of light bleed. Not so much here. Lately, the gaming laptops from Asus we've reviewed have not really had any discernible, worth talking about, backlight bleed. My Acer Predator had a lot more. Some MSIs, they're okay with backlight bleed. They're not that bad, but they tend to have lower contrast. That's the problem there. So dark scenes in movies and dark dungeons, that sort of thing, can be a little bit hard to see here. So this one I like a lot. It holds up well against the Alienware 15R3, for example, and the competing Predator and all the others. And you can see the specs on screen there. It's your usual 300 nit bright display. Pretty good representation of color gamut there. Asus also lists a lower quality panel with only 50% of Adobe RGB. Obviously, we don't have that one here, but if you find one that has a real lowball price on it, it might be that. So try to see that display in person before you buy it if you can. Performance, in terms of CPU, it's about as good as it gets unless you move up to the even higher and overclockable CPUs, which you usually don't see in 15-inch laptops. Alienware will do that, not much elsewhere. The 7700 HQ is a strong 45-watt CPU. Again, fast as any mobile workstation out there, fast as any other gaming laptop, and it benchmarks as well on CPU tests. Heat and noise are really fine on this. You will hear the fans from the minute you boot it up, which is typical of quad-core laptops, generally speaking, especially ones that aren't super thick, but they're not roaring. When you play games, you'll hear it, but it's not obnoxious or loud. The surface temperatures do not get hot anywhere. Nowhere is burning hot at all. It's not even worth doing a color graph to show you the heat because there's just not that much heat here. And it helps because, well, the 1050 and the 1050 Ti graphics cards from NVIDIA, they're in a different class. The GTX 1060, 1070, 1080 are the high-end gaming cards. They tend to generate a lot more heat. They need their own fan, that sort of thing. The 1050 and the 1050 Ti are your middle-of-the-road ones, and you'll see the 1050 in the Dell XPS 15 latest edition, for example, and obviously that's not even meant to be a gaming laptop. Also, the latest Dell Inspiron Gamer is using the 1050 Ti and the 1050. Performance for the 1050 Ti, and that's the one that's tweaked. It's a little bit faster than 1050, obviously. It's okay. If you're buying this mostly as a pro apps kind of laptop, it's more than enough to accelerate Adobe CC. Adobe CC really doesn't do that much better if you give it a 1080 versus a 1050 Ti, for example. It only uses acceleration to a certain point. If you're buying this for a gaming laptop and it's usually secondary on the road kind of gaming laptop, you don't want to throw a lot of money at it, it makes sense. If it's going to be your primary laptop for gaming, and gaming is important to you, then I would say I would try to scrimp and save or cut in other areas and get something with a GTX 1060 card, because 1060 is about 33 to 40% faster in benchmarks and in gaming experience. So that's significant. Also, it's about half as fast as the GTX 1070s. So you get the idea. With the 1060, you can play any current game pretty much at full 1920 by 1080 resolution on high settings, if not very high. Here you're having to drop down to low and medium for today's more demanding games. Even DirectX 12 optimized games like The Division and Battlefield 1. And you can see for yourself on screen here, I started out thinking, well, let's go for 1080p in medium, and that was really not so good. I turned on VSync for all these tests so you can see the absolute max frame rate, even if it's going to exceed the 60 hertz refresh rate of this panel. And you're best off with either low or low to medium settings for today's more demanding games. The Witcher 3 would really hobble this poor thing. I found that for The Division, I got the best gameplay actually when I dropped it down to 1600 by 900 resolution with a mix of medium and low settings. Battlefield 1, you could do full 1920 by 1080 and maintain near 60 frames per second as long as you put it on low with a couple of medium settings thrown in. So it's not a killer gaming laptop, but then again, it's also not killer gaming laptop price. That said, if you spend about $200 more, you start getting into some real serious territory for gaming. For example, the MSI Leopard Pro, the GP62, that's $50 more, and you get the GTX 1060 there in a 15-inch gaming laptop, and a faster 7200 RPM hard drive, but there's no M.2 SSD. Personally, I'd upgrade that 2.5-inch SSD, 2.5-inch drive to an SSD myself, and you'll get that faster drive performance. There's the Sager NP8155, it's $1129 with the GTX 1060, and that's available at Exotic PC also. Same CPU, no SSD, that story again. And then there's Asus's own ROG GL502VM. That's the lower end version of the Strix, older Strix that we have here. That is a 1060 as well, and G-Sync for $100 more. So it's not a bad buy for the money, but really it depends on what you're looking for. Like I said, you know, for pro apps and your occasional gaming and you have a main gaming rig at home, it works fine. But if it's your primary machine for doing all things, yeah, I would still think about something with a GTX 1060 if you could. So there you have it, the Asus ROG GL553VE, also available in a VD edition. I know you're going to make jokes about that in the comments, for $1099 with the GTX 1050 instead of the 1050 Ti. As a productivity and pro apps laptop, it certainly makes a lot of sense. If you're really on a tight budget and you want a game, it makes sense too. If you can afford a little bit more though, you can see how much more performance you get from the GTX 1060. There you have it. I'm Lisa from MobileTechReview. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more cool tech videos, and thumbs up if you like this vid.